The Human Cycle by Sri Aurobindo. Chapter 17. Religion as the Law of Life. Since the infinite, the absolute, and transcendent, the universal, the one, is the secret summit of existence, and to reach the spiritual consciousness and the divine, the ultimate goal and aim of our being, and therefore of the whole development of the individual and the collectivity in all its parts and all its activities, reason cannot be the last and highest guide. Culture, as it is understood ordinarily, cannot be the directing light or find out the regulating and harmonizing principle of all our life and action. For reason stops short of the divine and only compromises with the problems of life. And culture, in order to attain the transcendent and infinite, must become spiritual culture, something much more than an intellectual, aesthetic, ethical, and practical training. Where, then, are we to find the directing light and the regulating and harmonizing principle? The first answer, which will suggest itself, the answer constantly given by the Asiatic mind, is that we shall find it directly and immediately in religion. And this seems a reasonable and, at first sight, a satisfying solution. For religion is that instinct, idea, activity, discipline in man which aims directly at the divine, while all the rest seem to aim at it only indirectly and reach it with difficulty, after much wandering and stumbling in the pursuit of the outward and imperfect appearances of things. To make all life religion, and to govern all activities by the religious idea, would seem to be the right way to the development of the ideal individual and ideal society, and the lifting of the whole life of man into the divine. A certain preeminence of religion, the overshadowing, or at least the coloring of life, an overtopping of all the other instincts and fundamental ideas by the religious instinct, and the religious idea is, we may note, not peculiar to Asiatic civilizations, but has always been more or less the normal state of the human mind and of human societies, or if not quite that, yet a notable and prominent part of their complex tendencies, except in certain comparatively brief periods of their history, in one of which we find ourselves today, and are half turning indeed to emerge from it, but have not yet emerged. We must suppose, then, that in this leading, this predominant part assigned to religion by the normal human collectivity, there is some great need and truth of our natural being to which we must always, after however long an infidelity, return. On the other hand, we must recognize the fact that in a time of great activity, of high aspiration, of deep sowing, of rich fruit-bearing, such as the modern age, with all its faults and errors, has been, a time especially when humanity got rid of much that was cruel, evil, ignorant, dark, odious, not by the power of religion, but by the power of the awakened intelligence and of human idealism and sympathy. This predominance of religion has been violently attacked and rejected by that portion of humanity which was for that time the standard-bearer of thought and progress. Europe, after the Renaissance, modern Europe. This revolt in its extreme form tried to destroy religion altogether, boasted indeed of having killed the religious instinct in man. A vain and ignorant boast, as we now see. For the religious instinct in man is most of all the one instinct in him that cannot be killed. It only changes its form. In its more moderate movements, the revolt put religion aside, into a corner of the soul by itself, and banished its intermissence in the intellectual, aesthetic, practical life, and even in the ethical. And it did this on the ground that the intermissence of religion in science, thought, politics, society, life in general, had been and must be a force for retardation, superstition, oppressive ignorance. The religionist may say that this accusation was an error and an atheistic perversity. Or he may say that a religious retardation, a pious ignorance, a contented static condition, or even an orderly stagnation, full of holy thoughts of the beyond, is much better than a continuous endeavor after greater knowledge, greater mastery, more happiness, joy, light upon this transient earth. But the Catholic thinker cannot accept such a plea. He is obliged to see that so long as man has not realized the divine and the ideal in his life, and it may well be even when he has realized it, since the divine is the infinite, progress and not unmoving status is the necessary and desirable law of his life. Not indeed any breathless rush after novelties, but a constant motion towards a greater and greater truth of the spirit, the thought and the life, not only in the individual, but in the collectivity, in the communal endeavor, in the turn, ideals, temperament, make of the society, in its striving towards perfection. And he is obliged, too, to see that the indictment against religion, not in its conclusion, but in its premise, had something, had even much to justify it. Not that religion in itself must be, but that historically, and as a matter of fact, the accredited religions and their hierarchs and exponents have too often been a force for retardation, have too often thrown their weight on the side of darkness, oppression, and ignorance, and that it has needed a denial, a revolt of the oppressed human mind and heart to correct these errors and set religion right. And why should this have been, if religion is the true and sufficient guide and regulator of all human activities and the whole of human life? We need not follow the rationalistic or atheistic mind through all its aggressive indictment of religion. We need not, for instance, lay a too excessive stress on the superstitions, aberrations, violences, crimes even, which churches and cults and creeds have favored, admitted, sanctioned, supported, or exploited for their own benefit, the mere hostile enumeration of which might lead one to echo the cry of the atheistic Roman poet, quote, "To such a mass of ills could religion persuade mankind," end quotes. As well might one cite the crimes and errors which have been committed in the name of liberty or of order as a sufficient condemnation of the ideal of liberty or the ideal of social order. But we have to note the fact that such a thing was possible and to find its explanation. We cannot ignore, for instance, the blood-stained and fiery track which formal external Christianity has left furrowed across the medieval history of Europe, almost from the days of Constantine, its first hour of secular triumph down to very recent times, or the sanguinary comment which such an institution as the Inquisition affords on the claim of religion to be the directing light and regulating power in ethics and society, or religious wars and widespread state persecutions on its claim to guide the political life of mankind. But we must observe the root of this evil, which is not in true religion itself, but in its infrarational parts, not in spiritual faith and aspiration, but in our ignorant human confusion of religion with a particular creed, sect, cult, religious society, or church. So strong is the human tendency to this error that even the old, tolerant paganism slew Socrates in the name of religion and morality, feebly persecuted non-national faiths like the cult of Isis or the cult of Mithra, and more vigorously what it conceived to be the subversive and antisocial religion of the early Christians, and even in still more fundamentally tolerant Hinduism, with all its spiritual broadness and enlightenment, it led at one time to the milder mutual hatred and occasional, though brief-lived, persecution of Buddhist, Jain, Shaiva, Vaishnava the whole root of the historic insufficiency of religion as a guide and control of human society lies there. Churches and creeds have, for example, stood violently in the way of philosophy and science, burned a Giordano Bruno, imprisoned a Galileo, and so generally misconducted themselves in this matter that philosophy and science had in self-defense to turn upon religion and rend her to pieces in order to get a free field for their legitimate development. And this because men, in the passion and darkness of their vital nature, had chosen to think that religion was bound up with certain fixed intellectual conceptions about God and the world, which could not stand scrutiny, and therefore scrutiny had to be put down by fire and sword. Scientific and philosophical truth had to be denied in order that religious error might survive. We see, too, that a narrow religious spirit often oppresses and impoverishes the joy and beauty of life, either from an intolerant asceticism or, as the Puritans attempted it, because they could not see that religious austerity is not the whole of religion, though it may be an important side of it, is not the sole ethical religious approach to God, since love, charity, gentleness, tolerance, kindliness are also, and even more divine, and they forgot or never knew that God is love and beauty, as well as purity. In politics, religion has often thrown itself on the side of power and resisted the coming of larger political ideals, because it was itself in the form of a church supported by power, and because it confused religion with the church, or because it stood for a false theocracy, forgetting that true theocracy is the kingdom of God in man, and not the kingdom of a pope, a priesthood, or a sacerdotal class. So, too, it has often supported a rigid and outworn social system, because it thought its own life bound up with social forms, with which it happened to have been associated during a long portion of its own history, and erroneously concluded that even a necessary change there would be a violation of religion and a danger to its existence. As if so mighty and inward a power as the religious spirit in man could be destroyed by anything so small as the change of a social form, or so outward as a social readjustment. This error, in its many shapes, has been the great weakness of religion, as practiced in the past, and the opportunity and justification for the revolt of the intelligence, the aesthetic sense, the social and political idealism, even the ethical spirit of the human being, against what should have been its own highest tendency and law.